Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting to order of the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee. The preliminary matters are the mandate that I inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee's Groundwater and Committee today. If any member knows of any conflict of interest or appearance of conflict, please so state at this time. Hearing none, we can move to the next preliminary item, which is approval of meeting summary from March 9, 2002. While I realized many of you weren't here for that meeting, I'm hoping the people had a chance to review it. Commissioner Anderson?
Move for approval.
Do I hear a second? Thank you. From Commissioner Keene. All in favor? The motion passed, so the meeting summary has been approved. Now we're going to move on to the action item, which is request approval to proceed to the EMC for adoption of a technical correction of 15A NCAC 2L 0509, and Karen Crom will be the presenter. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair Bailey and fellow committee members. You basically said everything I was just going to say, so. Yeah, I'm here to request a citation correction to Rule 0509 of the 2L standards. We're seeking approval because the risk-based rules were readopted in 2019, and they re-lettered 0507, which is not the rule that we're talking about today. It's the 0509B, which references 0507. And we need to change that from an E to an F. So it'd be 0507E and change to 0507F. I guess the technical correction falls under a circumstance where the agency is not required to publish a notice in the North Carolina Register, hold a hearing, or submit the amended rule to the Rules Review Committee. Oh. Okay. So this correction, we're asking for this correction because we are trying to ensure that our rules are all in order for us to ask for renewal of our application to the US EPA, UST state approval or state program approval. And the proposed amendment is included in attachment A. Oops. So our proposed schedule will be present today, then re-present to the EMC for adoption on March 9th with a tentative or expected effective date of April 1st, 2023. And we're requesting the approval to proceed to the EMC for the adoption of this correction to the citation of Rule 2L 0509.
And that concludes your presentation.
Yeah, did I say who I was?
I did. So I covered that, and I'd like to thank you for, I don't know, maybe there is a shorter amendment to a rule than I've seen before, but this has got to be a record.
Yeah.
So thank you for your short presentation.
Sure.
For the short, tiny rule change. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Commissioner Anderson moves to approve to proceed to the EMC for adoption of a technical correction to 15A NCAC 2L.0509. Do I have a second?
I second, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Weiss seconds the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
The motion passed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The next item on the agenda are informational items. As I've told a few of you, since we have some new members and we also do not have a robust agenda these days because there aren't as many rules that we're required to adopt, I asked both divisions to put together some informational items to give us an introduction to the two programs and how they work together. Director Scott is with the Division of Waste Management, and also Director Rogers is here because his groundwater section is involved with these issues. So normally you see him with the Water Quality Committee, but he always sits with us because of the groundwater section. So I'll turn it over to Director Scott today, and welcome. We appreciate your putting together this presentation for all of us.
Yes, you're quite welcome. Thank you, Chair Belly, members of the committee, and welcome new members. I'm Michael Scott, Director of the Division of Waste Management, and we appreciate the opportunity today to share with you some information about our 5 programs within our division and the vast scope of work that they address on a daily basis across our state. So today we're going to touch on a little bit about the Division of Waste Management, the acronym DWM, talk specifically about our sections. There's 5 of them. Give you a little idea of our budget as a state program and some of our areas of focus. And we work on a lot of diverse areas. One of them is coal ash. This is the capped industrial landfill in Rockingham County where the coal ash was placed at that particular Duke Energy plant. So a lot of work on that front for sure. But what do we do? A lot of different things, to be honest. One of our main charges is the protection of groundwater, the implementation of this committee and the Commission's rules regarding the preservation of groundwater as a drinking water source across North Carolina, meaning the 2L standards. We do lead remediation on a lot of different sites. We have specific contractors and work across various programs to address contamination at sites. We have a very active and growing brownfields program that helps facilitate redevelopment in North Carolina, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. We do perform a lot of compliance activities. We're a regulatory division. We're out and about. We do a lot of inspections. We follow up on a lot of citizen complaints, federal complaints that get forwarded to our state. And we issue a lot of permits. We permit all the landfills in North Carolina, all the gas stations where you may fill up your car unless you're driving an electric one. It has a UST permit. As you go in the door and open the door to that convenience store, you'll see a UST permit for that store, which allows the fuel to be delivered. And we're also active in emergency response, whether it's a pending hurricane, a fuel release, or another type of emergency, type of a product release. Our division's responding, often with our colleagues at Water Resources. So within the department, DEQ's mission is to provide science-based environmental stewardship for the health and prosperity of all North Carolinians. We accompany that with our specific division in waste management, where we're working to prevent harmful releases of waste to the environment and clean up existing contamination. So we're working to do that through issuance of permits, technical assistance, compliance activities, and then unfortunately when releases do occur or have occurred in the past, we work diligently to clean up existing contamination. Our priorities as a division are to continue to institutionalize a philosophy of waste prevention, aggressive completion of cleanups, and seeking creative solutions for continued use, reuse, and redevelopment of contaminated properties across all of our remediation programs. So as we stated, we do work diligently to prevent the releases of waste. When we find waste that's in place, like this old landfill site north of Raleigh up near Wake Forest, we work to assess it. We have programs that can clean it up, remediate it, and put that particular exposure risk into a better state for a community or a specific area of North Carolina. So one of our primary charges here to prevent releases of waste to the environment, but also clean up existing contamination. We're comprised of almost 280 full-time staff. We're often at about 300 staff when we count our temporary workers, which we really appreciate, help us with additional workload that's incurred, everything from summer interns to 40-hour temporary staff that help us across various programs. We do track key initiatives like the amount of contaminated land we put back into productive reuse, whether it's brownfields, Superfund NFAs, RCRA closures. We do track the amount of acreage we're able to return to productive reuse. And also one of the key items is the amount of private capital funding that comes through our division, primarily through brownfields, over $1 billion last fiscal year related to redevelopment across North Carolina. And as I mentioned, we are a regulatory division, so we're out and about with almost 7,000 compliance inspections performed the last state fiscal year. That's what SFY stands for. And we also track the number of homes or businesses where we're trying to prevent an exposure to a contaminant, whether it's the active world of PFAS and emerging compounds or chlorinated solvents. We have programs that not only can sample for contaminants in water, but then quickly pivot to providing homeowners a safe drinking water supply, primarily our Bernard Allen program that by statute can provide bottled water and ultimately filters or connection to municipal water. So we are comprised of 5 very distinct, but also at times very different programs. So we've talked a little bit about brownfields. We'll talk more about hazardous waste, which a lot of you are familiar with. This is a picture of a solid waste example, one of our major regional landfills and the tippers that tip those trailers to allow the garbage that comes in or waste that comes in every day to be safely managed and covered. Our Superfund program, and then our biggest program, the underground storage tank program, which addresses both petroleum releases above and below ground. So we're divided into these 5 groups, but oftentimes, especially with the world of emerging compounds, we find that these programs are working succinctly together on a site or on a release, and so that's a great thing. So as Chair Bailey stated, I'm Michael Scott. I'm the director of the program. We're very fortunate to have just an awesome deputy director with vast experience, Julie Woosley, a lot from the hazardous waste sector and a lot of diversified state government experience. And then our 5 section chiefs, which Vance Jackson, the section chief of UST, is with us here today. So talk a little bit more about each specific program. Brownfields is a little unique. They don't have rules or anything in the administrative code. So sometimes we don't talk a lot about brownfields because we're not bringing rules before this committee nor commission because they're all statutorily based. They're in North Carolina law. But their objective is to encourage safe reuse of abandoned environmentally impacted properties, combining economic development, but also making sure public health protection occurs. And the means to do that is the issuance of a brownfields agreement, which provides liability protection for the PD, who we call the prospective developer. There are also tax incentives, which basically keeps the liability from previous environmental impacts from preventing the redevelopment, like you see in this picture, of properties moving forward. This program is very active on several fronts. We're encountering more and more sites where methane is an issue, old landfills or old waste areas where we need to address that specific exposure risk. We're seeing across North Carolina an increased interest in townhome development. Not everybody wants a yard, not everybody wants the maintenance, so they look at townhomes. Townhomes often present a challenge when it comes to managing the restrictions that a brownfields agreement may have, because you have a lot of different tenants. It's hard to identify one party that's responsible, whether it's a groundwater restriction, a soil restriction. So we've been working on guidance to help the prospective developers that are encouraging townhome redevelopment across our state, what they need to do in order to work, within the brownfields program. A big theme for our division is VI, vapor intrusion. I think it's something that this committee, in the future, potentially the commission, may ultimately, be addressing will be, do we need more formal standards? I'll talk about action levels for this not new, but exposure risk that exists. Whether it's contaminated soil or contaminated groundwater, you can have an indoor air environment that presents an exposure risk. So VI is an important term, and I'll touch on it today, and kind of a new scope. We've worked on groundwater a long time. We've worked on surface water a long time. We've worked on air emissions quite some time, right? A lot of experience, standards. The world of VI is continuing to develop, but it's also an area where you don't see as many regulatory standards or thresholds, but it's still an area of potential exposure risk, and we'll talk about that today. Brownfields did cross a major threshold with the issuance of their 600th agreement in North Carolina. So we really are excited about the number of properties that have come into this program and continue to be redeveloped across our state. So touch on just VI a little bit more. This is a good illustration of a home. You see underlying groundwater in blue. You see soil and other particular features like bedrock here, and these red arrows where you may have contaminant vapor intrusion into a building, especially a crawl space or especially a basement, or areas that can be of specific concern if there are, once again, contaminated media like groundwater or soil that are emitting vapors. Brownfields must address this issue to make sure people are safe to reuse this new or renovated property, and make sure that there's active not only sampling to assess it, but there may be a need for mitigation systems to cut off this particular exposure. And one that we work on quite a bit, to give you an example, is the compound TCE, and we'll talk a little bit more about that briefly this morning. So this is a powerful slide for our work currently. Soil and groundwater. This is specific to brownfields, but it has some applicability for other programs. Soil and groundwater are no longer necessarily your main risk assessment drivers, and that's what we're doing. We're assessing risk, assessing environmental contamination, cutting off that exposure through cleanup of sites or through risk-based remedies, meaning mitigating the risk even if the contaminants are left in place. Oftentimes, soil and groundwater are easily eliminated through land use restrictions. Don't use the groundwater. We won't let you put in a well, use that well as a drinking water source. That addresses the contaminated groundwater. Or cap or remove the soil. VI, vapor intrusion, is often more difficult. You can't easily cut off exposure like soil or groundwater, and it often can be mitigated, but it's hard to eliminate, similar to the example of radon. And also when we put in, we call them VIMs, vapor mitigation systems, they do have to be designed correctly by an engineer, they have to be installed properly, and even more importantly, they have to be maintained. You know, are they plugged in? Are they operable? Are they being monitored? And then you run into specifics like utility lines and cuts into concrete foundations that can allow these vapors to come into an area. So proper stewardship is often necessary. So the take-home message here is we are working on an active front of the world of vapor intrusion. And I think, you know, before this committee, commission, in future years, this will be an active topic, you know, whether it's standards development or just keeping this committee briefed on the sites that we're encountering where this is an exposure risk regarding existing environmental contamination compared to how easily we can mitigate contaminated groundwater or contaminated soil. So an important theme for us this morning. As we transition to one of our other programs, I think a lot of you may be familiar with the world of RCRA, the federal requirements that we implement as a state program. Our hazardous waste section does ensure the safe management of hazardous industrial waste by implementing those federal RCRA requirements. We do have a lot of work in the hazardous waste program currently to include the emerging compound front and work on renewable energy sources, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But this program's integrally involved in the Comores site. This is a picture of that site in Bladen County, North Carolina, the Cape Fear Rivers on the far right. The red dots show you different groundwater monitoring wells, associated PFAS levels to include Gen X, PFOA, and then the combination of PFOA and PFOS in groundwater at this site. And so a lot of work through our department, DEQ, but also coming through this particular section, the hazardous waste section, implementing the requirements of the 2019 consent order that were reached between our department, Cape Fear River Watch, and the Comores Company, and also the addendum that was signed in 2020. So not only are they focused on the management of hazardous industrial waste across our state, but they're also a leader in our division when it comes to the work on emerging compounds, to include the Comores site. And this gives you just a quick snapshot. This slide's got a little age on it, but it shows you the Fayetteville Works property, the brown polygon in the middle, where Comores is actually located, and all of the residential well sampling that continues here beyond 2021 into 2023, where we are now, to find wells that have been impacted from the air deposition of these PFAS compounds that impacted groundwater and ultimately impacted private well users and their associated water supply. So this section ultimately is responsible for this work in the Division of Waste Management. We've also been keeping this committee and commission briefed on the continuing discussion on solar farm decommissioning and the particular pieces of legislation, House Bill 329, House Bill 951, and the associated reports that were due to the General Assembly. One of these reports did come through the Environmental Management Commission. It was a joint report regarding our current regulatory programs, our ability to address end of life for solar facilities, knowing that North Carolina is one of the top 5 utility scale solar providers in the country. And how are we going to manage these panels once they reach their end of life? Whether it's 20 years or 30 years, there's different perspectives on how long the panels will last, or maybe the facilities simply have the panels replaced or upgraded and they're never fully decommissioned. But this has been an active topic. This program, Hazardous Waste Section, is also the one who's been leading, working on this particular effort, along with Jessica Monty, who's with us this morning, on the particular reports that were required by House Bill 329 and 951. And this illustration just kind of supports that. As we look at more solar facilities coming into our state, the projected lifespan, this is a graph based on a 20-year lifespan projection. Industry will tell you they expect the panels to last longer than that. But it gives you an idea, this upcoming decade, the 2030s, are when some of these facilities may need to be repowered, potentially decommissioned, meaning panels would need to be recycled, properly managed. How are we going to address that? So it's a powerful graph, projecting future work and certain decision points that may need to be made. As we transition to our third program within the division, this is the solid waste program. Another great coal ash picture for you. This is the Sutton plant outside of Wilmington, North Carolina, where the coal ash was transitioned from impoundments into this lined industrial landfill. It's a beautiful site to me. Proud of all the great colleagues who work on this front and make sure that this material is safely managed for our state. Solid Waste does manage that particular waste stream through guidance, technical assistance, regulations, permitting, and also a lot of environmental monitoring, not to mention our compliance activities. And we're addressing not only industrial and sanitary waste streams, but also other unique waste streams like septage. A lot of people don't think about it, but a good portion of North Carolina is not on municipal sewer. So how does it get managed? Well, we permit the 600 companies who come to your house, maybe like mine, remove the contents from the septic tank, safely manage it, transport it, take it to a publicly owned treatment works or to a permitted site that our division allows that material to be safely treated and managed at. We also have involvement with recycling facilities, whether it's composting, scrap tire processors, and also the world of construction and demolition, waste processing, and a lot of work, as I've noted, on the coal ash front. So some quick facts for you. We do have 93 landfills in North Carolina that disposed of just over 13 million tons of municipal solid waste and construction and demolition waste in fiscal year 2020-21. The excavated coal combustion residuals from the Duke Energy impoundments totaled almost 2 million tons and were disposed of in on-site landfills like the one here in Asheville, which is an amazing structure with its engineered wall. You can see the great elevation on the edge of that landfill where that coal ash is going into. And some of the coal ash is also being sent for beneficial use to particular STAR units at Duke Energy's Buck, Cape Fear, and H.F. Lee facilities. All right, as we transition to Superfund, this particular program includes several key program areas. Our Inactive Hazardous Sites program, which was created to protect public health and the environment from releases of uncontrolled, unregulated hazardous waste substances that may not be addressed by other programs, and also help facilitate cleanup and reuse of sites contaminated by those releases. We also have the Federal Remediation Group that works a lot directly with EPA to investigate and respond to sites that qualify for cleanup under CERCLA. because of their magnitude or impact, and they also work with the DoD, which stands for Department of Defense Sites. We have a large military presence in North Carolina and a lot of environmental work related to those military installations. And we do also have a dry cleaning program, a manufactured gas plant site program, which is in that special remediation group, and a pre-regulatory landfill program, which helps to address North Carolina's over 600 sites that were used as disposal locations before formal federal and state requirements were there for landfills. So we do receive a portion of disposal tax funding to properly assess and ultimately find a remedy for those pre-regulatory landfills. And this is a very interesting site in Ashe County. The picture, this is the Ore Knob Mine. If you ever want to read about it, it has a very interesting and fascinating history. It is a Superfund National Priority List site based on the risk from the tailings, the mining tailings and the associated impoundment, and the proposed risk to surface waters in the area. EPA did a Superfund remedy to secure that tailings impoundment, preserve surface waters around this site, but as you can see, based on previous activity, very little grows based on that previous mining operation. So a lot of fascinating work and a very diverse scope of work in the Superfund program. And as I noted, this program also works on vapor intrusion, and TCE is a predominant compound. We did want to share a little bit about this with the committee this morning. This is a compound where we do have indoor action levels. We work directly with the Secretary's Science Advisory Board, which provides guidance to DEQ. We did this in 2019 with their final recommendation on particular action levels related to this contaminant and the potential exposure risk from vapor intrusion. And TCE is an important one because it presents a short-term risk. In the work of the environmental field, there are risks that have short-term effects and risks that may have effects over quite some time, meaning years. This is a compound that for women of childbearing age, it can present a risk in a very short-term manner. And so immediate action and follow-up response is needed. So we worked with the Secretary of Science Advisory Board to go through our particular responses to sites that have vapor intrusion with this particular contaminant, TCE. We divided that into scenarios where there are residential, they're in a residential format, and then more of a commercial or non-residential, approach. And here we derived levels associated with EPA regional levels on what levels of this contaminant TCE could be in indoor air in micrograms per cubic meter that would be safe for those inhabitants of a residential area or a non-residential area. And then the associated actions through notifying our division, coordinating with us on fact sheets and informing the public, and then initiating measures to really cut off this exposure, whether it's changing heating and ventilation measures or incorporating specific filters. Yes, Commissioner Carter.
Oops, excuse me. I just have a quick question. I'm looking at the action levels, and for non-residential, it's about 4 times what it is for residential. Is that based on the time, the length of exposures?
Yes, so it's based on exposure time frame. Residential, you could be there, basically 24 hours a day. Some people are. They work at home or they're not working, versus a non-residential, the exposure window of time. Your point's well made. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. And so these levels were derived, in coordination with EPA, regional screening levels. We show this slide not to get too far into the weeds, but to once again give you a flavor of some of the ongoing critical work that showcases some of the important fronts that we are focused on each day. And this has not been before the EMC as something adopted into code, meaning a rule. This is something we're using as action levels to inform whether it's residential or non-residential tenants of what may be going on the property so they can make informed decisions, while also obviously working with the property owner. And then transitioning to our underground storage tank program, this is our largest section in the Division of Waste Management. We do register, permit, inspect, and collect operating fees for commercial underground storage tanks like the one shown in this picture getting ready to be installed. We do a lot of work overseeing cleanups of releases from these tanks. Unfortunately, when they are underground, we can have a release and then a release that could threaten or potentially impact groundwater or other receptors that we need to address. There's a lot of work to manage the resources of the cleanup fund, meaning after a release occurs, how is funding available and the financial assurance to make sure that facility can adequately address this cleanup. And we do respond to releases of petroleum from other sources also. And the great example there is the massive release in Huntersville, North Carolina, outside of Charlotte, of the Colonial Pipeline, where, as Colonial has stated, at least 2 million gallons of fuel were lost from that particular pipeline back in 2020. And so not only are we working on the Colonial Pipeline site, the ongoing remediation, working towards a corrective action at this site, but also there's work on the emerging contaminant front with this program. A lot of fuel releases in the state. AFFF firefighting foam is used to mitigate the explosive risk from fuel releases, and oftentimes AFFF can contain emerging compounds, meaning PFAS. So we have to be aware of that when we remove soil, send it for disposal, or decide the best way to manage it. And a little more on the Colonial Pipeline release. I know we've mentioned this to the Commission in some of my director comments, but this has been a historic release for our state, really for the nation, in my opinion. It was discovered back in 2020. Colonial Pipeline, or CP, has reported that they lost about 2 million gallons. That will be the largest onshore gasoline spill in the United States history. You hear a lot about offshore or spills that impact surface waters. This one was underground, impacted groundwater, is the largest onshore. Yes, Commissioner Clark.
Yeah. We're messing with that thing. I'm curious, they lost 2 million gallons, how long did it take them to detect they were losing gasoline?
Yeah, that's a question that's still up for discussion. The first answer is almost a few weeks went by before they.
It wasn't just a day or two.
Yeah, before they knew it, it was longer than a day or two. Yes, we've looked at some different calculations. Colonial has done a lot of calculations. It's in the time frame of several weeks is the short answer to that. The unfortunate part is that the current monitoring systems did not discover it. 2 teenagers on all-terrain vehicles discovered it. They drove down the right-of-way, noticed an odor, came back, actually saw some of the fuel, more strong odor, and had the mindset to make a phone call, right? We need to talk to the fire department, somebody to see what's going on, and then realize the severity of what actually was going on, meaning this amount of fuel. Like I said, it's not what you hear about in the news, meaning surface water impact, but onshore is the term. It's the largest in the United States history.
So if they hadn't gone down that right away, we might still be leaking.
I would like to think that would not be the case, but fair point. Yeah.
It seems like you keep a little bit closer tabs on your inventory and know that you're losing.
Yeah, we've had that conversation. Point A to point B, what goes in the pipe in Texas, what ends up in the Northeast. But very good point. The simple answer, that we've discussed in length has been whether it's a complete breakage, an immediate rupture of the pipe, or a slow over time. And that was your first question, and that's the difference there.
I guess if it was slow leakage, that gives it a little more or less obvious. Maybe they should have picked up on it, but then I'm sure there, who knows how many tens or hundreds of millions of gallons go through there in a year or so. So I guess this may be a fairly small quantity for them.
Yeah, it's a massive pipe with a massive volume of flow, to your point. Yeah. The pipeline has been repaired. The particular petroleum contact water free product, that's all being trucked off site. The great news is the last bullet. Even though we've had groundwater impacts, it's limited to the area of the release, and we've not had water supply wells, meaning the residential community that lives around this release site, has not had petroleum contaminants in their well water.
So other than all the pumping you're trying to do to get the contaminated water out, there's not going to be any treatment, otherwise it's going to be just natural attenuation. So
they have a proposed treatment system before us and before the Division of Water Resources for an NPDES permit. And so they have filed that And so they are proposing further on-site treatment with a discharge. That permit has not been issued, it's under review, but that speaks to your point regarding what's next on the treatment. Currently, they've been in a free product recovery mode, pull it out, truck it for processing, recovery, and then they're going to be transitioning to this further on-site treatment as they filed the permit for the NPDES discharge.
Thank you.
All right, as we wrap up, I won't get too far into the weeds, but I did just want to share with you as you talk about the different programs in DEQ, we're all funded through a lot of different ways. And I think the take-home message of this slide, it shows you our 5 programs, the divisions on the far right, but it also gives you a flavor. We do receive state appropriations for some programs. That's the green bar. We are implementing a lot of federal requirements, Superfund, hazardous waste, the UST program, and we receive federal money. That's the lighter blue bar. And then we do have receipt programs where we issue permits, we charge money for those permits as allowed by statute or rule, and gives you an idea of the different funding levels coming into our programs. Often it's not one funding stream, meaning just federal or just a state appropriation. And then we do implement special funds where a tax is collected, whether it's a special fund regarding UST cleanup, which here is one of our bigger funds, or whether it's in Superfund, the pre-regulatory landfill program, which is funded by a disposal tax to assess and ultimately remediate these old landfills that were put in before regulation. Not to mention some of our smaller funds like the electronics program and solid waste. We do implement various what we call special funds that come into the division. So as we start to wrap up here, can't have a conversation about our division and all the hard work colleagues do, and it's a great group we have at the division, a lot of historical experience, and we're also welcoming a lot of new colleagues as some of our colleagues are starting to retire. But when it comes to emergency response, we do permit the sites, disaster debris sites for the state of North Carolina when vegetative and construction and demolition material have to be managed, like the hurricane shown here approaching North Carolina. We do a lot of work to provide IT updates and transition to the use of drones and other technology, field tablets that we take out into the field when we have releases or instances that occur after emergency management events. So when this type of work occurs, whether it's a hurricane or a major release like Colonial Pipeline, it's a lot of great colleagues collaborating and a lot of hours of work that go into it, and one that we take very seriously and also tend to really enjoy. It's a great scope of work.
I wanted to ask a question there, excuse me. Well, I live on the coast, and so when hurricanes come through, I'm used to seeing huge piles of trees and debris. Mm-hmm. And can you just go into a little more detail about how long it takes to get these the sites set up for handling this, and where they take it, just a little bit more, since that's one of those issues that we face quite often here.
Yeah, great question, and this is a role Jessica Monty works a lot in and has helped us over the years. A lot of these sites are pre-approved, so they don't have a landfill permit, but they're a temporary, that's a key term, temporary disaster debris site. And they can take vegetative material straight from your community that the local government would pick up, and they can also be allowed to take construction and demolition. If a tornado hit a community or a major hurricane, results in a lot of construction and demolition waste, it's temporarily stored at these sites until it can be trucked to final disposal, meaning landfills. What our message is to local governments is to get these pre-approved before an emergency. We do have to check them in coordination with other state agencies to make sure there aren't particular artifacts or sensitive plant species. We can't just put one of these temporary sites in a location without some level of review and coordination with other state programs. And so the key approach here is getting them approved before the disaster or the emergency occurs, and oftentimes that's done in direct contact with your county or local governments. And then once they're pre-approved, we can activate them, is the next term, very, very quickly for waste to be started to move to those locations. What we often see is that a county has one or two approved, but maybe they're not in the location where the emergency occurred, and we need additional locations that are pre-approved. Oftentimes, it's the backside of the wastewater treatment plant or the old athletic field that's no longer used on the outskirts of town. But it does provide a great way to get waste out of communities after a natural disaster and then stage it for several months until it goes for final disposal. Yep. And we do training on this, and it's very important when we enter scenarios like this pending hurricane, as the picture shows. Yep.
So these communities already have these pre-approved sites that might have been pre-approved for years?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
And then say like a community that's hit by a tornado, there might
Yep.
be more in the middle of the state that isn't used to having
That's right.
disasters.
Yep.
They might have to scramble.
Yeah, we will work diligently to get them through the approval process. Once again, the site has no artifacts, no sensitive plant species. You know, we can't just put the waste anywhere. We got to check certain boxes and coordinate with other state programs. But we will work expeditiously to get that approved. Normally, it's a few days. It's not hours, few days. But in your example of a tornado outbreak in the middle of the state, and they may not have these sites pre-approved like the counties that are preparing for hurricanes, we normally work with them to get that done in a matter of days so the waste can then be safely stored. The key is if the sites are not pre-approved by DEQ, then the local government can run into real implications with FEMA when it comes to reimbursement. FEMA will not let the money flow without knowing the waste was stored temporarily in a location where it did not create further problems. Does that make sense? So there's a real
that's
check and balance with federal money in a state of emergency if this does not occur in the correct way.
Thank you.
And we do have a lot of information. I just want to end here on the IT front, but we do have a site locator tool. You should be able to just Google that term, DEQ, Waste Management Site Locator Tool. You can find a county, a town. All of these are respective dots that we have data on. They're a permit or they're a known release. They will tell you something about the environment when you click on that dot. And the great thing is there's also a document link which will take you to our electronic file management system, Laserfish, where you can pull up the entire file for that site that we have on it. So if you're looking in an area or concerned about a particular piece of property, you may be able to find information on it through this website. It doesn't cover all of DEQ. It's more related to our Division of Waste Management, but it's a good initial resource for you. And we are working to get data into an electronic format, meaning our transition to Equus, getting lab data directly in electronic format rather than paper. And the department, you'll hear more about this, I'm sure, but we're really working on the front of permit transformation and how to get our programs transitioned to more unified databases, really having our regulated entities to be able to track where their permits are in the processing stages across DEQ. So a lot of exciting fronts here on the information technology area. And with that, rule readoption, we did make it through the 10-year rule readoption process. We completed that in 2021. I appreciate all of our colleagues who worked on this and all the support from the committee and the commission. The Rules Review Commission did publish a draft schedule for the next 10-year review cycle. So we'll be talking about this in the upcoming years. It's coming up quick, to be honest. But we did complete that last cycle, which means I think this process should be a little easier in that some of our rules that were readopted were over 20 years old. And we did a lot of work to get them up to speed. And as we face this second round of periodic rule review, I'm hoping it goes fairly smooth and that we spend a lot of time this last cycle. And you may be asking yourself, why is Waste Management report to the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee? Our name is part of the acronym for the committee, but most of the rulemaking authority for most of our waste management programs was transitioned from the Commission of Public Health to the EMC in 2014-15, and there's the session law that you can reference. Our division has a lot of roots in vector control, environmental health, and so we did report, except for UST, to the Public Health Commission rather than the Environmental Management Commission. So that gives you the legislative background on that. And we do have the joint authority on groundwater requirements and standards with DWR for 2L. And so hopefully that helps with a little of the background information while we come to the EMC, while we come to the Groundwater Committee, and also who we are. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Director Scott. There were a couple of items that I was curious about in terms of the possibility of rules other than that 10-year review that you just talked about. The two that I saw were the vapor intrusion and solar panel decommissioning rules. That can you just give us a little insight into development of rules for those two programs?
Sure. So on the vapor intrusion front, like I mentioned, we have worked with EPA to look at these screening levels, meaning when we find, and this is specifically for the compound TCE, when we find it in indoor air through vapor intrusion, these are screening levels when we need to have a further conversation, and in some instances fairly quickly. We have looked at eventually do some of these screening levels need to transition to administrative code, meaning come before the committee and the commission. I would say we're not quite ready for that, but it's a conversation we have had for sure. So more to come on that particular front, but a lot of ongoing work with TCE. When it comes to solar, we did report out to this committee and commission that our initial recommendations were that formal rule development was not needed for solar decommissioning because we have a very robust solid waste and hazardous waste program that currently can manage these panels when these facilities need to be decommissioned. That conversation furthered with a second piece of legislation that asked us as a department to look more specifically at the need for financial assurance for these solar facilities, and we issued to the General Assembly a report on that front. What we are still planning to engage this committee on would be the potential universal waste designation for these panels that we would see coming before the committee first before broader discussions on rule development. We do feel like we answered that question. It's been a couple of years back now, but we did address that question that rules were not immediately needed. But we do think that this universal waste conversation needs to continue with the committee. So that homework assignment's on us. We're waiting for some additional information, federal and other states who are pursuing that universal waste designation for solar panels. And I think that will be our starting point, Chair Bailey, coming back to this committee.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from any of the other commission members? Oh. Commissioner Lowry?
Well, I wanted to say thank you for arranging to have this informative session. I thought it was very useful for me. And again, I wanted to say thanks for your thoughtful presentation. The one question I had was regarding your discussion about septic tanks and disposal and so forth. And I don't know if you would want to comment on the agricultural waste or things like that. Is that also consideration for your division, or is that a separate group that regulates the hog farms, other types of agricultural businesses and the waste associated with that?
Yeah, great question, and that's important to distinguish that. Richard's group, Director Rogers, they have the requirements for the animal feeding operations to include the management of swine waste and other animal manure. We will manage a small amount of animal manure in compost facilities where the predominant waste stream is solid waste, meaning food waste or other solid waste type materials. We have the specific designation for septic management, which there's also EPA guidance for managing septic tank waste. It also includes waste from porta-johns, like when you go to a football game and see all the porta-johns. And a growing waste stream for our states and others that not many people talk about or know about is grease trap waste. Every restaurant you go to has to have a grease trap to keep the fats, oils, and greases out of the municipal wastewater system, or it clogs it up. So those three waste streams, grease trap waste, portable toilet waste, and septage, domestic septage from homeowner septic tanks, are managed by this program. The vast amount of waste goes to a local treatment plant for proper treatment. We do permit over 100 sites that manage it in an agricultural setting. That waste has to be lime stabilized or treated through other processes as required at the federal level, but it can be used as a nutrient amendment. It does have macro and micronutrients in it. but the vast amount of animal waste and those types of permitting programs do fall in the Division of Water Resources.
Commissioner Key?
That's fine. Good overview. The TCE, the vapor intrusion, you mentioned EPA and doing these studies and bringing it before committee and commission. Is there something that has triggered, and you said the immediate, is there something triggered this in North Carolina that has brought this to the forefront? Or is it something coming from the EPA?
Yeah, it's been a little of both. So EPA has worked on some critical Superfund, we'll call them highly contaminated sites where TCE has been detected, and they have used this 2.1 range screening level to make sure that residential properties were not impacted by that Superfund or federally, designated highly contaminated site. As we have looked more and more across our state, we're finding through different industrial practices, different industrial cleaning practices, that TCE was used as a degreaser, a cleaning agent, and ended up in groundwater or the soil, and the business emitted it to the environment. And then it has the potential to then impact indoor air as it's emitted under that building or residential property. So to answer your question, some of this foundation is with EPA and their work in North Carolina. We then took that work and other literature from around the country and presented it to the Secretary's Science Advisory Board, which you hear about as a commission member. And they gave us input on these screening levels and also our actions regarding when these levels are detected. And the simple scenario is women of childbearing age, we don't want to be exposed to levels above this 2.1. We want the HVAC system to be modified. We want indoor air filters to be brought in, which our division now has its own VOCARB units that we will deploy to a house or an apartment complex as the testing continues, because it doesn't take but a few days, short-term exposure, for a woman that may be pregnant or trying to get pregnant for this to impact them. It's a short-term exposure. So that's why this is different. A lot of the work in the environmental field deals with longer exposure, days, years, you get what I'm saying.
Yes,
TCE is a very narrow window for this population, women of childbearing age. And so that's why it's something we take very seriously. We make sure we've got proper assessment data, but we move quickly when that data comes in to make sure that the homeowner's informed. Then they can make the best decision on what they do. Can we treat the air? Do they go to someone else's home for a few days until the assessment is wrapped up? But it's all about risk communication and immediately sharing the information.
So your stakeholders, you're going to follow up, please. If your stakeholders would be, I guess, the Department of Health,
Yes.
State Department of Health.
Yeah, great point. We always visit a site with DHHS,
Yeah.
Department of Health and Human Services.
Right.
We also notify the local health director and their staff at the local level, and then obviously the property owner. It may not be the tenant, it may be a building manager or a company, and we have this very formal conversation, meaning here's the data, here's the potential risk. How do we need to communicate this effectively so that people can make an informed decision regarding, their safe living space?
And your other stakeholders would be the Home Builders Association, all the HOAs, all of that incorporated in your process, bringing
Right.
this back before committee.
Right.
These stakeholders.
They would be. And we had the public comment process, to your point on stakeholders, with the SSAB. So they're not a regulatory body like this one is, but they're in the advisement capacity for the department, and they had a public comment process
Yes.
on this slide I'm showing you that all of those stakeholders, had the opportunity to weigh in on. And so, like I said, this is an important topic. That's why we put some focus on it this morning, and this could be an area we revisit with the committee. Further discussion, rule development at some point. I don't think we need it immediately, but want to keep you informed.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, if I could just follow up with one more comment that Commissioner Carter
Certainly.
wrote earlier, just a few minutes ago. The monitoring piece on the Colonial Pipeline spill, that rupture, and I picked up, it was my understanding through the conversation that it was not just days, but it took weeks, and then there was speculation that it might have gone longer if someone had noticed it, some four-wheelers or whoever was going through the property. On the rulemaking for underground storage tanks, I remember going back real quickly to the stick readings, dropping sticks down and pulling up measurement sticks to see how many gallons of fuel are in it that morning, and monitoring it to see how much I pumped during the day, and then sticking it again at night and making sure that it equals, the inches equal the number of gallons in the tank to correspond with the number of gallons you pumped in a car that day. So going from that, the technology, and then the rules, regulatory rules for underground storage tanks, we had to go to electronic monitoring, and of course the cost and having to do economic impact analysis and all that. But now moving forward to these pipelines, my concern is what Commissioner Carter said, that if there are sections of a pipeline that burst or rupture and they go into the groundwater source, then how long does it take them to monitor millions of gallons of fuel that is not in the pipe? And are the what I'm asking, I guess, through that comment, what are the regulations to Colonial or anyone else who's pushing, whether it be natural gas or whether it be gas or solid product through a line? What's our rule, or is it in the rule that they have monitoring in different quadrants or sections of that pipe running through the state of North Carolina, whether it be through a municipality or a rural area? So is there a rule from this state that says you have to have a monitoring device that tells you to tell us that you've got a leak, no matter how much volume you're losing? Because if you're pumping millions of fuel through a pipe, you've got millions and billions of dollars invested, then does this state have a monitor, since we're supposed to be the largest spill in the United States? Do we set a rule for that? That's my question.
Yeah, great question. The regulation for this pipeline comes at the federal level. So it comes through PHMSA, not really through DEQ. So this is, across several states, Texas to New Jersey pipeline that is regulated by PHMSA. That's the pipeline hazardous materials safety group that has the regulation for it. We don't issue a DEQ UST permit. We were responding as the state agency on the petroleum release. What we did do, though, and PHMSA required it too, was the conversation with Colonial. Why did this potentially occur? The short answer is there was a collar, a repair at the pipe. How many other repairs exist in our state's boundaries? We're not discounting other states, but we need to focus on North Carolina first. That's our purview. And assessing those to make sure there aren't potential or other leaks in those areas. But the short answer is the formal regulatory authority doesn't fall with DEQ on this type of pipeline. It's at the federal level. And they also issued an order to Colonial, meaning specific requirements to address this. But then there was the follow-up on this is potentially while it occurred, this previous repair, it's called a collar, and how many of those other collars exist, getting those assessed and also repaired or replaced to make sure the same thing doesn't occur. So I hope that helps. But the UST rules before the commission are for gas stations like you're very familiar with, Commissioner Keene. They don't really address the commercial pipeline like Colonial.
Okay, follow up, may I? My concern is the state and what's happened, and finding a solution that it may happen again. You say, well, address these callers, that it may never happen again. Mm-hmm. That's nice. Mm-hmm. But what is required is that we get a report on the state level that this is happening, like right now. This is happening. This occurred 3 days ago because we have a device a monitoring device that says we're losing fuel. We want to report this to the state authorities because it's happening in this particular region in Mecklenburg County, or it's happening in this particular region in Pasquotank or Quinlan's where it's rural and you got a well zone, or sanitary districts. The whole thing is that how do we know that there's a leakage instead of 2 weeks later? And we have to deal with it as a state, even though it's federal. We're going to ask for some regulatory piece on monitoring. That's all. Just monitor.
Well, I would answer your question in that we did reach a consent order. There was a $4 million penalty first, right? They were fined. And then there's a legal document governing the steps forward on this site to include the additional corrective action work, assessment work, and to your point, what monitoring needs to occur. I will tell you there's been a lot of conversation, Commissioner Carter's point, how much was lost, how quick, why was it not caught earlier, hours, minutes, not days or a few weeks. And that conversation has progressed to other technologies that are being looked at. So I would point and answer your question to that consent order, that legal document that governs our work as DEQ with Colonial on this site forward, and what notifications they have to share, the sampling. That's the best path forward. But yes, to your point, we don't want information going to a federal entity and us not being notified, whether it's per Quinlan's County or the particular county, that you referenced. We want to have that information sooner rather than later.
I was just comparing municipalities in areas of the state versus rural areas.
Right.
And sectors of a pipe, where it goes.
Yep. Yep.
If we can know, so the local governments is there a monitoring system that can tell us in days instead of weeks?
Yeah, no, point well made, and I can tell you it's been a very active conversation on the monitoring front. So,
Thank you, Madam Chair.
So just to follow up on that, I understand they have a federal permit, which requires the reporting. So now do we have an agreement that's like statewide for any releases, because they're required to do it under their federal permit?
right,
So
right.
now does this consent order apply to beyond Colonial site?
The consent order is specific to Colonial Pipeline. Yeah.
So if they have a release somewhere else?
Yeah, they're going to have to report any releases to us, immediately. Here, I think the point of contention is they didn't find it, they didn't know until the
Right.
fire department called them. So, but yes, they have to notify DEQ of releases, and so that occurs very near term. The problem here was they didn't know it was occurring until,
I understand that. But are they, it's not our permit, as you said, so is this all, under the purview of the Oil Pollution and Hazardous Substances Control Act? Is that what the penalty was assessed under?
Yeah, it was assessed under 2L with OPSCA references, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of the reporting requirements, it's going to be AFSCA, right?
Yep.
Which is not a permitting system, but it's a state law requiring a report as soon as the release is detected.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Mhm.
Are there any more questions? Commissioner Weiss?
Thank you. And thank you, Director Scott, for that, for your presentation. I've learned a lot. I have two questions. One, I'm circling back to the TCE discussion. How is it detected in the first place if there's this critical window or important window of getting in there and remediating? How does that happen?
Yeah, great question. So we have also screening levels for soil and groundwater. So typically you'll see groundwater data that'll come in, and it may be very elevated for TCE. We then look at the possibility of it entering the residential or commercial space, and we may even have soil gas data. So there's several pieces of data that then lead us to a fairly immediate concern about the indoor air in that building. And then those data sets are then augmented by actual indoor air sampling. So there's a series of data that are reviewed, and based on those levels, you're reaching an initial conclusion that there's a potential risk, and then that's substantiated by the actual indoor air being sampled. So that's kind of the series of events, and then you're working to mitigate that indoor air.
And the data collection centers are,
Private consultants.
oh, all right, and they're just throughout the state?
Yep. They will send us data, and we've had training and communication with them. As they're reviewing the data as environmental and licensed professionals, here's data that we want to be aware of. Here are the screening levels. If you see this data, you need to flag it, get it to our program for a secondary review so that we can have a quick conversation on it. And then, like I said, you quickly escalate that to communication with Department of Health and Human Services, then develop a risk communication plan for the building tenants, whether it's commercial or residential. The goal is to share information, right? What you don't want to run into is the scenario where you have data and you've had it for 2 months and you didn't give it to the occupants. That's a very, very difficult conversation. So some people question the expeditious nature. It's essential because people want information and they want to make informed decisions. You're not alarming them, but it has to be handled in a manner that's very succinct and timely. Otherwise, that's your worst scenario. How long have you had this data? Why did you not tell me about it? It's a very difficult conversation.
Thank you. And my other question actually sort of dovetails with this. In the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about the various remediation and cleanup that the department is responsible for, but is the department responsible for overseeing that? You don't actually have a unit, have folks who do the physical remediating?
Yeah, we oversee the vast majority, and then we employ contractors. So we send out proposals for private companies to do contract work for our department, specifically for our division. And then we pay those contractors to perform the remedy. So our staff are not in the field driving the equipment or pumping out the groundwater or digging up the soil, but we're reviewing all of the data and paperwork that private consulting firm and their contractors have deployed to the site. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So it's a combination of both, and that's a good thing. If a company is still there and viable, they're the responsible party, they're performing the cleanup and sending us reports. But in a lot of parts of our state, there's no viable responsible party, but you still need to address the risk, and that's where we deploy a contractor to assess it, and then the contractor will deploy other private companies to do the remedial work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
Chair Smith?
A couple of questions, and thank you for the overview. I thought that was
Appreciate it.
really helpful. And it's a good description of how the programs are designed to work. My question is, as a practical matter, historically, a challenge has been making the programs work the way they are designed to work with limited resources. And I think the last inactive hazardous sites program report I looked at was probably 2021. And in that report, I think if you looked at the category of, chemical contamination incidents, it being handled by the inactive hazardous sites program, there were 2,500, something in that neighborhood, that were open, so they were still ongoing incidents, not ongoing in the sense that the contamination was ongoing, but they still needed to be assessed and remediated.
Right.
And about 10% of those were being actively worked on. The UST program has had similar challenges over the years because of cash flow and trying to set priorities for which sites get remediated, assessed and remediated first, and just how you work through that backlog. So I assume that continues to be the case, but can you just speak to that a little bit in terms of what percentage of sites need additional work, but we have to prioritize resources to address a limited number in any given year?
Right, great point. Yeah, like Chair Smith gave the example of the inactive hazardous sites program and the Superfund group. There's over 2,000 sites, but the funding, a lot of it's appropriated money, is limited, so we have to rank sites. The highest risk, intermediate risk, low risk, and UST does the same thing. And you're focusing your resources and your staff time on the highest risk. Somebody's drinking contaminated water, or there's potential vapor, like we've talked a lot about this morning. That's where you're focusing your resources. So to Chair Smith's point, you know, there may be 4-digit or several thousand sites on the list, but we may only be working on triple digits, meaning 100 or even less than 100 with the funds we have. But the good thing is we have ranked them so that we're identifying where there's a potential exposure, right? Because risk is dose and exposure, right? And so if we can rank them, determine the highest risk, make sure that's addressed, you know, that's the approach we have to utilize with our funding, and also in the UST program. But as you know, we've noted here, you know, fairly recently, Vance's program's done a great job on a federal initiative to really close out a lot of our low-risk sites, get them off the books so they don't just sit there. But Chair Smith's point is very valid. There's a vast scope of work. The funding and the resources have to really be aligned with the most critical. So often it's a percentage, and it's far less than 50% of the sites are being worked on. Sometimes it's less than 25. Yeah.
So let me just add to that. In what we plan for a future committee meeting, you might see on there, it says it's the DWM overview of current and ongoing site cleanups. So that's going to be in March, just wait for it. But, so I think it would be great if you could give some more ideas to what you'd like to see for our March presentation, Chair Smith.
Thanks for reminding me of that. I think that's a great issue to pursue. And I think one follow-up question that may be good to take up at that time is, given the fact that we have this gap between resources and need, and have to set priorities, are we setting our priorities based on the right set of factors? And one question I think that comes to mind, particularly recently, is, are we looking at the cumulative effects of multiple sites? So we often have a UST incident and an inactive hazardous site in relatively close proximity to each other. And so how does that play into setting priorities if you have a community that's potentially exposed to multiple sources of groundwater contamination? So that's a really good set of issues to pursue. And the only other thing I'll add, and this is a comment, not a question, I do want to say, when we talk about groundwater mitigation in the context of these programs, a lot of times that means a combination of immediate sort of emergency response. So the inactive hazardous sites that we can't get to right away in terms of full assessment or remediation. If we know there's contaminated drinking water, people are getting bottled water, but bottled water is not the same thing as a water line. And so we've got that gap too in terms of temporary versus permanent response. And so there are just a lot of issues like that in terms of how you prioritize action and pull together all the resources. And it's a challenge because there have never been sufficient resources to do it all at one time.
That's right. Yeah.
And Commissioner King?
Responding to Chair Smith in the comment, one of the original thoughts going into my questioning on the EPA, a directive on the vapor piece, is that something that has triggered it in North Carolina, or is this a directive from the federal end? And being so, and think of resources, grant writing or priorities from our steering committee or our department, along with the other departments under DEQ, and then moving over to other departments outside of EPA or health department, then where do we line up for resources asking on the federal end? What boxes do we check in our priority assessments? How do we come up with those priorities? Is the vapor piece, or is it groundwater? Is it USD? Is it brownfields? So, you know, my question in moving through 23 into 24, and if this is a gap of networking or an opportunity to network and check off the boxes through, if we do a grant writing process, I don't know how that works for resources throughout your department. I'm clueless.
Well,
But
we-
if it's something that we're going to add to committees and add to the board itself, the commission itself, then where does it rank so we can get the quickest dollar, get the boxes checked off, get those funds from the federal end, so we don't have to put it off, and continue to talk.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I would answer it by saying, you'll be pleased to hear we really have got an influx of brownfields funding coming in for 2023. And we have a group that is now going to solely manage the 600 agreements that have already been completed. So they won't be working on new properties. They're managing what's been completed, from vapor intrusion to our land use restrictions being followed. And we've got not only a local government assessment grant that EPA is giving us to deploy contractors to help local governments assess contamination, especially in rural and certain economically qualified areas, but also to fund this property management unit, which works a lot on vapor intrusion. And so, answering your question partly, we did get federal funding to help address that scope and add some resources there. So that's great news. It's just the start, but it's great news in that, we're seeking some federal assistance, and we wrote a grant and successfully obtained it to help on that front.
Are there any other questions? Well, I wanted to thank you very much, Director Scott, for putting this together, especially for the new members of the commission. And I hope some of these questions at the end will help you flush out the March presentation. You can see what we're interested in.
Yep.
But it's, all the different programs that you have to manage is an amazing job that you and your staff are doing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
The next informational item is on 15A NCAC 2L0202, the groundwater quality standards, which we just worked on with Bridget and last year. And so I'm thankful that Bridget is going to be able to make it today. We weren't sure where she would be. She's going to be a new mom pretty soon.
You're cutting it a little close today, but happy to be here.
I'm so glad that you could do the presentation. I don't know if I could describe how hard Bridget worked on getting these through and giving the commission all the information we needed to pass the standards. But this will give you some background on what we went through. It was an enormous effort to put through all these new standards and get them codified. So I'll turn it over to you, Bridget.
Great, thank you. And good morning, Chair Bailey, members of the committee. I'm Bridget Shelton. I'm the Groundwater Standards Coordinator with the Classifications and Standards Rules Review Branch within the Division of Water Resources. So as mentioned, I'm here today to give an info item on the overview of the North Carolina 15A NCAC 02L0202 groundwater quality standards. So a quick introduction. North Carolina groundwater quality standards are the maximum allowable concentrations of contaminants in groundwater which may be tolerated without creating a threat to human health or which would otherwise render the groundwater unsuitable for its intended best use. The best usage of groundwater is defined in rule as an existing or potential source of drinking water for humans. So these groundwater standards protect the groundwaters of the state as a resource for human consumption. They are used and implemented in many different programs. Where groundwater quality has been degraded, the goal of any required corrective action or cleanup is to restore the resource to the level of the standards or as closely as possible. So the groundwater standards are not a federal program. They're done at the state level using the rule 15A NCAC 02L0202. They protect the human adult population and they target ingestion and household use. So unlike surface water standards that protect both human and aquatic life populations, groundwater standards focus on protecting human health.
I just wanted to interject something for the newer people, as I think it's an important point to know that this is not a federal program. Each state has a different way of regulating their groundwater, and I personally am very proud of our program that we've got all these standards codified, because I've worked in other states where that's not so. So I think the Division of Water Quality has done a great job on this, but it's an important point.
Okay, thank you. So where to find the standards? Subchapter O2L is called the Groundwater Classifications and Standards. Section O100 has general considerations, including definitions. Section O200 has both the groundwater classifications, and O202 has the groundwater quality standards that we'll be talking about today. So here are some important points that are included in the O2L groundwater quality standards rule. This is text summarized from the paragraphs of the O2L rule listed in the bottom left corner here. So first, when there is no standard or IMAC, which I'll cover later, for a substance that is not naturally occurring, that substance is not allowed at levels above the practical quantitation limit, or the PQL. The PQL means the lowest concentration of a given material that can be reliably achieved during routine laboratory analysis. So the PQL is essentially the lowest level of a substance that can be consistently measured in the lab. When a standard has been established for a substance and that value comes out to less than the PQL, the detection of that substance at or above the PQL is considered a violation of the standard. So if the established health-based value for a substance is less than that PQL value, or the lowest level that can be reliably measured in a lab, then the PQL value is used as the standard for that substance. So as laboratory analysis capabilities are constantly developing, these PQL values can change regularly, and they can vary from laboratory to laboratory. And the PQL value is used in implementation when there is no groundwater standard or IMAC, or when we are in the process of developing a health-based value for a substance. But just a reminder that PQL value is a laboratory value. It's not used when we're developing these health-based standards. And I will soon briefly cover which criteria we do use when we calculate and develop these groundwater standards. So continuing with important points in the O2L rule text, summarized with the paragraphs listed at the bottom left here. So when two or more substances exist in combination, the Director of Water Resources may consider the effects of chemical interactions. So this text addresses potential additive effects of chemicals. Next, when a naturally occurring substance exceeds the established groundwater standard, the naturally occurring concentration or background level may be determined and used as the standard. This is an important point here, as it is possible that certain metals can be naturally occurring in groundwater due to geological conditions. So these potentially naturally occurring levels are site-specific, as every site and area is unique. So each site would need to determine the background concentrations for the individual metal of concern at that site. So moving on to cover the development of groundwater standards. So the rule lays out how we establish standards and what we are able to look at when we are establishing a standard for a substance. So we look for the lowest of the following 6 criteria or endpoints. First, a concentration that protects the non-cancer or systemic effects of a contaminant. Second, a concentration which corresponds to an incremental lifetime cancer risk of 1 in a million. We also look at the taste threshold and the odor threshold, as well as the National Drinking Water Maximum Contaminant Level, or the MCL, and the National Secondary Drinking Water Standard. So those both are from EPA. So the process for developing a standard for a substance begins by finding these values if they are available. And then the rule also lays out which references can be used when finding those values. So the list of references in order of preference here is EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, EPA's Drinking Water Health Advisories, other EPA risk assessment data, and other relevant published health risk assessment data and scientifically valid, peer-reviewed, published toxicological data. So we are limited to these references when we are developing groundwater standards. So here's how a groundwater standard is calculated. The non-cancer endpoint calculation is at the top and the cancer is at the bottom. So for the non-cancer endpoint, it's reference dose times the body weight times the relative source contribution divided by the water consumption rate. And for cancer, it's the risk level times the body weight divided by the cancer potency factor times the water consumption rate. So note that the highlighted red text here are values that are defined in the rule. So body weight is 70 kilograms. Water consumption is 2 liters per day, and those are both for adults. And the cancer risk level is 1 times 10 to the negative 6, or 1 in a million. And then here is an example of those calculations. So you take all these values, you plug them in, and you get the numbers at the end highlighted here. So in this example, you choose, or in all of the examples, you choose the lowest to be most protective of human health. And in this example, the groundwater standard will be based on the cancer endpoint at the bottom here at 1.2 micrograms per liter. So as a reminder, when a standard does not exist for a substance, that substance is not allowed at levels in groundwater at or above the PQL. However, any person may petition the director of DWR to establish an IMAC, which is an interim maximum allowable concentration. So these are designed as calculated values to protect human health that are done at the director level to ensure that an accurate and health protective value can be established in a shorter timeline than the rulemaking process can sometimes take. So IMACs often do provide relief for the regulated community, as PQL levels for particular substances can be quite stringent. And the rule lays out how someone may request an IMAC, and IMACs are developed following the guidelines in the rule. They are calculated using the same process and references as groundwater standards, following the procedures covered earlier, and IMACs are legally enforceable. So in the most recent review of the groundwater standards rule, which became effective in April of last year, April 2022, some language was added to better clarify the process to establish or update or remove an IMAC. So that process is summarized here with text from the rule referenced in the bottom left corner. So any person may request the director of DWR to establish, update, or remove an IMAC. The requester submits this request to the director and includes any relevant data, study results, and calculations. The division then reviews this request to determine that the information submitted is in accordance with paragraphs D and E of this rule. These paragraphs cover the toxicological information and references required to calculate a standard. If the information is not in accordance with the rule, the director may request additional information, and if this additional information is not provided, the request will be returned to the requester. If the information submitted with the request is appropriate, at least 30 days prior to establishing, updating, or removing an IMAC for any substance, the division shall provide public notice and an opportunity for comment. So this public notice is emailed to interested parties and posted on the division's website. And the notice will include the received request, the level of the proposed IMAC that was calculated by DWR, and the basis or references upon which this calculation was relied upon, as well as how to provide comment, so an email address or a phone number. When an IMAC request is received, the director will establish, update, or remove the IMAC or return the request within 180 calendar days. So moving on, within 12 months of establishing an IMAC, the director will make a recommendation to the commission whether a new groundwater standard in place of the IMAC should be established or whether the IMAC should expire. After this recommendation is presented, the commission may decide whether to initiate rulemaking to adopt a new standard in place of that IMAC. So language was also added to allow IMACs to now expire. So an IMAC will expire either the date the EMC declines to initiate rulemaking to adopt a standard in place of that IMAC, or the effective date of the rule adopted to establish a standard in place of the IMAC, or after initiating rulemaking, the date the EMC declines to adopt a new standard in place of the IMAC. So for example, after receiving public comment on the proposed rulemaking to adopt a standard, the commission decides not to move forward with adopting that standard, the IMAC for that substance would then expire on that date. So throughout this process, if an IMAC expires prior to the adoption of a standard for that substance by the commission, any person may request that IMAC again following the guidelines outlined earlier. So that summarizes the steps for the establishment, update, or removal of an IMAC and essentially covers the life of an IMAC. Language was also added in the rule to address reporting of this process. So if an IMAC is established or updated, the IMAC will be posted on the division's website, and the EMC will be notified within 30 days at the next scheduled EMC meeting. Also, the director will provide an annual update to the commission on the status of any IMAC actions, including any pending IMAC requests. So here is a comparison between IMACs and groundwater standards. So IMACs are considered temporary, but both IMACs and groundwater standards have regulatory framework with the O2L 0202 rule, and they're both legally enforceable. They are both internally reviewed and go through a secondary review process with the Division of Public Health at DHHS and DEQ's Division of Waste Management. IMACs, however, do not go through an official public hearing or comment period or a fiscal analysis as required by the APA. They are approved and established by the Director of the Division of Water Resources following the procedure in O2L 0202C. While groundwater standards do go through the rulemaking process as they are approved and established by the EMC. As mentioned, we do, however, notify the public when an IMAC is established, updated, or removed. It goes to public notice and is put on the DWR website, and we allow an opportunity for comment. So from the implementation side, there should be no difference between the use of an IMAC value or a groundwater standard. They are calculated the same way, and they are both legally enforceable. So moving on to the periodic review of the groundwater standards rule. So O2L 0202G states that groundwater quality standards shall be reviewed on a triennial basis. So this periodic review is done to consider whether to recommend to the Commission that new revised groundwater standards be adopted to make sure the values are up to date and that we have accounted for any new toxicity information that may have been published or updated since these standards were last established. So DWR staff reviews the available research and literature, considers any needed modifications, and prepares reports or the review package. These reports are reviewed both internally and also sent to toxicology staff at Waste Management and DHHS for further review and discussion. So the rules review process for groundwater standards is shown here. As I mentioned, the groundwater rule and standards are reviewed using the available literature, and staff develop a package or recommendation to take to the EMC, the Groundwater Committee, and then the full Commission. This recommendation can include updates to the standards, values based on new or updated information. The EMC decides on whether to approve or of any changes to the rule, which then go to public notice and hearings and public comment. We then come back to the EMC for approval, and then, if received, to the Rules Review Commission for approval. Then if we get approval, the rule is updated. Since the groundwater standards are not a federal program or federal requirement, there is no EPA approval required, unlike the surface water standards. So the most recent review of these standards was completed and approved by the EMC on March 10th, 2022 of last year. And the rulemaking to incorporate these revisions was completed in April 2022 of last year, and that's when the revisions became effective. So more information on this review and rulemaking can be found on this link here. And this most recent review of the groundwater standards focused on incorporating a number of IMACs into the rule as groundwater standards, about 45 of them, I believe. So after this recent rulemaking, 16 IMACs do still remain. These IMACs will be included in the upcoming review of the groundwater standards, where they will be presented to the Commission for either removal or for adoption as a groundwater standard. Prior to the next triennial review of these groundwater standards, there is the option available for any person to request that an IMAC be updated or removed following the process in O2L 0202C. This was actually recently done for PFOA, a PFAS compound, which was removed as an IMAC effective November 4th of 2022. And more information on these IMACs can be found here at the link. Thank you. My contact information is here, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Bridget. That was excellent. Just a couple of things that I wanted to follow up on. We did have an exchange about the public comment on the IMACs and your chart that said there was no public comment. But there is public comment that's associated with the public notice.
Yes.
And then can you tell me like how those public comments are incorporated into your review?
Yeah, so 30 days prior to any action taken with the IMAC, we publish the proposal, which is either removal or updating or establishing the IMAC. We publish it to the website as well as emailing it to interested parties on the listserv. We do provide opportunity for comment in that 30-day period. We provide an email address as well as a mailing address. And we essentially just look through those comments. This is not an official comment period as required by the APA, but we did want the public and stakeholders to have an opportunity to have their comment seen by us before taking action.
Okay, and then In terms of the review now, these are going to be included in the review with the entire water quality standards.
Yes,
Right?
yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so that's different than the other 10-year review of rules.
Yes,
So we'll see
mhm.
these every 3 years, which I think is a good idea,
So-
considering the information that we get, we can
Right.
update them.
Yeah, so the remaining IMAX that we have after this most recent review, there were 17, PFOA was removed, so there's 16 now. They're kind of grandfathered in, so they won't expire based on the rule language. So we will be reviewing those and presenting them to the commission for either removal from the IMAC list or adoption as a standard.
And then this might be something that Director Scott answers, but if there's an IMAC in place, I think they're on the website, all the 16, the 16 that are left. Can any hazardous waste remediation site use that IMAC, or do you have to ask to use the IMAC for a site? Do you see what I'm getting at? There's groundwater standards, but now we have 16 IMACs, and if another site came up that needed to use one of those IMACs, do they have to do a formal request, or do you just incorporate it?
Yeah, Bridget can pitch in here, but I don't have the understanding that any formal request is needed. The IMAC is published and it's applicable, across the state. I think what you're alluding to is sometimes one site or responsible party or consultant requests it of
Yes.
DEQ, and it may only be applicable to one site for its current use, but it's not limited to that site. So I don't know if there's anything
That
you want to
addresses
add,
it.
but
Yes, that
yeah, it's
addresses
Murphy to Manio applicability. But as we've been through the list, some of the remaining IMACs were only requested for one site or one cleanup, but the applicability is much broader. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I'd like to ask if any of the other commissioners have questions for Bridget. Chair Smith.
Just out of curiosity, do you have a rough idea how many IMAX are requested specifically in the context of remediation versus in the context of permitting a facility that may have a release to groundwater?
That is a good question. I do not have that information. I believe that information might be getting pulled together and presented soon by Waste Management.
Just another thing to keep track of for our March meeting. Thank you. Are there any other questions? At least in my experience, we started out with the actual shortest change to 2L I've ever seen, or any regulation, and now we ended up with one of the most massive ones that took a couple of years of committee meeting work together, along with Bridget. So sorry that most of you missed it. on this journey, along with Bridget. But anyway, your work is much appreciated. It was a wonderful job, and it's so good to have them on the books now. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
The next thing is upcoming items. You can, but for the new members, we usually have some idea of what's going to be on the agenda next for the commission meeting the next day. And today we have none, but sometimes we go over them just to prep everybody for the next meeting. And then the future committee meeting agenda items that we have are, again, informational items that I mentioned, and am expecting that we'll get some ideas about what the commission members need to hear for our next presentations on both water quality and waste management for those two items. So without further ado, I'll go to director's remarks, and Director Scott.
I just thank the committee for all your questions and attention today, and nothing further. Thank you, Chair Bailey.
Thank you. And Director Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do not have any additional comments, but do want to thank staff for their efforts in working on this presentation. And Bridget, you made it through. We're glad for that.
Yes, we're very glad. She's definitely our expert. I don't have any other closing remarks except always to thank the staff and the directors for their time in putting this together. So unless there's any other comment, Commissioner Carter's looking at me like he has a comment.
Well, I was just going to say, I've enjoyed this, my first meeting with your committee, so it's been great.
Yes,
And couldn't have hit a better one with all the information provided today.
it was a good way to start off 2023.
Yes.
Yes, so I'm glad it was good for you. I just thought it would be helpful for everyone in this period where we don't have that many rules that we're reviewing. So,
If I could make a comment, though, Director Scott, I've known Director Scott and his staff. You do an awesome job.
Thank you.
There's, back, I guess it was 8 or 10 when I was originally appointed to serve on this commission. I think it was maybe 7 million people in the state, maybe. I don't know exactly, but I think now it's in excess of 10 million. And waste management, the way that our state looks at it, and the way that your staff and the department have taken on waste management in this state compared to all the other states, I think they're just doing a remarkable job. There's so many parts to it, so many lanes, and I just hope that we continue to get the resources, the dollars in this department to handle waste management. Is so much needed, and when the influx of climate change and hurricanes and storms and tornadoes, everything that happens from refrigerators to wash machines that you see thrown out there to houses that are being torn down with nails and shingles and all of this that you see is waste. And just go to the grocery store and come home with just 2 people in the house, empty nesters, and what you deal with cardboard and plastic and all of this. And it's things that people really don't think of every day. And you guys are doing a great job. I just want to appreciate you.
We really appreciate that, and I will share that with colleagues, those kind words. Thank you.
yes, and on top of that, there's new programs with new kinds of waste like solar panel decommissioning. So there's always something new on the horizon, right? And are there any other comments from commissioners before I adjourn the meeting? Okay, so thank you everybody for attending, and I'm glad that other commission members could join our committee meeting here today. Adjourn. I didn't say the magic word. Thank you, Commissioner Keene.
Always.